Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of the Philosophy Roundtable. In this episode, we discuss democracies and liberalism and the philosophy behind political thought. If you're listening to this on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or any other audio app, you can check us out at the Babylon Project on YouTube, where you can find our other shows such as the Babylon Cast and Thinking Out Loud. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoy the content and want to see more. We genuinely appreciate it. We apologize ahead of time if this episode is incredibly sloppy. It is our first time, and I'm sure there will be many growing pains. Now, without further ado, I present to you Philosophy Roundtable. Welcome, everyone, to the first ever episode of the Philosophy Roundtable. I'm your host, Verne, joined alongside Aporia. Aporia, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm okay. As I was telling you before we started recording this episode, I just finished reading The Da Vinci Code, and it's a book that I've had on my backlog for, without exaggeration, it was on my backlog, I think, for about 2024, I think 10 years or so.
Hmm.
And I mean that. I'm not exaggerating, because I had watched Angels and Demons, I think, in sixth grade, and I thought the movie was fine. And then I read the book in high school, and I thought the book was fine, but I always wanted to read The Da Vinci Code just because of how controversial the movie was. And I finally read it, and I loved the book. The book's fantastic. I loved the Da Vinci Code. It's much better than Angels and Demons. And as much as I thought Angels and Demons was a fun read, it was a little bit. It was really on the nose. And so it's going to be a very quick aside, because I do want to talk about this. Like, I've been dying to talk to someone about this. The do you remember when the movie The Da Vinci Code came out and the controversy behind it?
I remember there was some controversy. I did watch it in class for some reason because school is about learning.
Wait, you watched The Da Vinci Code in school?
Yeah, we watched all sorts of movies.
Oh, that's all right. Do you remember what class this was for?
Oh boy, I'm going back. It was probably like similar to you, some sort of social studies or something like that. It was probably middle school.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I remember. I was very young when the movie came out, but I remember something about the Vatican disavowing the movie, telling people to not watch it. It was very controversial, very sacrilegious, and I remember being a little bit confused by that, because when I read Angels and Demons in high school, the book largely revolves, or it incorporates themes of like religion and science and whether or not you can unify the two, but it's a book that's very sympathetic towards religion. And so I remember finishing and wondering what the Da Vinci Code could possibly have that is so sacrilegious, because this book it's pretty sympathetic towards religion. um and then I read the book, and yeah, it's definitely sacrilegious. It's not an atheistic book. It's not trying to convince people out of religion. I think the Da Vinci Code, just like Angels and Demons, is sympathetic towards religion. But what appears to have been the case, and the reason why the Vatican and Catholics in general were so angered by it, was because it doesn't paint the Catholic Church in a very good light. The TLDR for it is Jesus had a wife, Mary Magdalene, whom he had a child with, which is a huge no-no in certain circles of thought of Catholicism. And the idea, I'm spoiling the Da Vinci Code. I apologize if you haven't seen or read it, but it's a very good book. Skip ahead 2 minutes if you don't want a spoiler for the Da Vinci Code. Wait, Aporia, do you want a spoiler for the Da Vinci Code?
Um, do I? I've seen the movie a long time ago, but do I remember what a spoiler might look like? Not really. No, I'm okay. You can spoil it for me.
All right. All I'll say is this: is it paints the Catholic Church in the people who, like, way back when, not the people in the Catholic Church now, but the people who were kind of constructing the Bible in the sense of like what gospels are going to be canon. It kind of paints them in a negative light, and it also, for fun. I don't think Dan Brown actually believes that Jesus had a wife and had a child with that wife, but like he'll play around with some conspiracy theories about the New Testament, and so maybe that's why so many people had this allergic reaction against it. I didn't think it was too bad. I mean, it's definitely sacrilegious if you're very pious, but I guess nowadays, where a lot of religious Catholics and Christians are a lot more liberal, I think that'd be perfectly fine if this movie were to come out now. But yeah, I love the book. Movie's okay. Movies, it's a book adaptation. It's fine. It definitely needed to be at least 30 minutes longer, and so.
The movie occupies the same space in my mind as the one where they steal the Declaration of Independence.
Oh,
In my head, they're the same movie. I know they're very different, but for some reason, I just maybe they both have a scene in the Louvre or something. Like in my head, they're just the same movie.
I've never seen that movie. I don't know.
It's a little different. Um, but yeah, um, I need to start reading books at some point. I'm totally online pilled.
Well, how have you been? What have you been doing recently with your free time?
Um, Me, I've been out with the groupies. I went to a Blink 182 concert. It was a good time. Good light show, good fireworks. It was fun. Besides that, not too much. I got my side hustle, which is just working a regular job. And yeah, I'm ready to cook, to learn new things, to analyze, introspect. How about you?
Well, we'll see what we can learn. One of so the actual topic that we were thinking about, and again, guys, this is our first time around, so there's probably going to be a lot about. I mean, the whole podcast is probably just going to be rough around the edges, just kind of trying to find an identity for it, and we'll see how exactly it's going to be structured in the future. But and so we apologize if it comes off super sloppy. But one of the things that we were thinking about talking about, and before we started recording, you had brought up a good distinction between political science and political philosophy, where political science is more of a descriptive analysis of what's going on in society, what's going on in a particular country, and political philosophy is a layer deeper than that, where now you're trying to think about what the philosophy behind certain norms and customs that occur either in a democratic society like the United States or any other society, right? So, for example, you can have on a political science lens, through a political science lens, you can kind of look at the fact as, okay, you have the electoral college, you have a democratic system or a democratic republic, and then you kind of like analyze what the field and what the landscape looks like from there. But then if you want to go even deeper, you go into political philosophy, where you start to think about, okay, well, democracy, why do democracies exist? Where do these ideas come from? Do they stem from people like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes? And do they revolve around the right to, a person's individual right to be able to um, determine what exactly is going to happen to them and who gets to rule over them? Are we even in a position to say that if we genuinely believe that all people are created equal, then why is it that almost by definition people who work for the government seem to have more rights because they're in the position where they can take away certain rights and stuff like that? I think one of the things that concerns me about the political landscape now is that you have buzzwords that exist, right? That a lot of people use, and that they say that I'm going to vote for this person because I'm a gun-toting American that loves freedom, and I want freedom within this country and all that stuff. And then you have another person who probably says like something very similar, like, yeah, I think freedom is important, but I don't think I don't think this political candidate's actually going to deliver freedom in the way that you think. And so I think on a macroscopic level, when we're analyzing the political landscape, it's very, very difficult to kind of like talk to people because people have different definitions of certain words that they use, and they're almost buzzwords at this point. And so, to give a particular example, let's say you have someone who says that they value freedom, and let's say they're a conservative. They're a conservative, values freedom, and to them, freedom means freedom from coercion from anybody else, from the government, or from other people. However, then you have someone else who's going to vote for Kamala Harris now that she's going to be the running the person who's going to be running for the presidency. Someone who supports her will probably say, yeah, obviously freedom matters, but freedom doesn't just mean freedom from coercive actions. Freedom also means the ability to be free and make decisions that you wouldn't have been able to make without some level of government intervention. So, the usual suspect that they'll kind of point towards to kind of demonstrate this is if someone doesn't have economic freedom, they can't have the same level of purchasing power that somebody else would have if they were born into a rich family. And so, you have the same word that is being used, but different people use completely different definitions for it. And I'm debating with myself about what is more useful, because right now politics is very chaotic, and so I don't know if it's more useful for these two people to have a conversation from a political science lens or from a political philosophy lens. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on that are.
Um, well, I think both can be useful depending on what conversation you want to have, right? I think it is oftentimes very important to take a step back in order to be able to take a step forward. So, whenever you have certain people who are have different definitions or completely different sort of ways about thinking about politics, a different framework. Well, in order to have a useful conversation, you sort of have to take step backs until you've reached the point where you have a shared understanding of the situation. So if you have two people who is like a tree, if you like follow a tree or a like a family tree, you can only really have a coherent conversation when you've went back enough in the tree that you have a common ancestor. Because otherwise, you will both have implicit premises that you hold in your head, and if you haven't gone far back enough in the tree, the abstraction tree, then you will have a conversation without having with while having different internal premises on the topic, and
Mhm.
so you will just talk past each other, um, and not make any progress. So I think it's always useful to, whenever you've realized that in a conversation you are talking past each other, you need to both ideally take a step back in the conversation until you've reached the point in the tree of understanding where you're on the same ground. So if somebody has a completely different framework of what freedom is or what we value in a society, right? So Republicans, Democrats both have different maybe values of what's important in the society. Then of course it's going to be extremely heated when they have like conversation about politics because they don't have the same premises. So both will talk past each other, and they will both have completely like arguments that are responding to things other people didn't say or misunderstanding. There's so ideally, if we were in a better situation, we would both come like take a deep breath and realize we're talking past each other, and both step back in the ladder and be
Mhm.
like, okay, so let's first talk. What are our values? What are our shared values? Let's maybe make a baseline of values. These are the stuff we can agree with, and then okay, let's really isolate what is the earliest point where we have a fundamental disagreement. Because you're never going to make any progress if you both value different things. And that's also assuming, of course, that people actually value having a real dialogue, right? Like some people aren't interested in that. So a conversation with them is less about actually coming to a shared understanding, but rather like to win or
Mhm.
as a so basically my opinion is if you're talking with somebody who has a genuine interest is not actually just trying to win an argument necessarily, and actually has wants to understand you. Um, and even people you don't necessarily want to understand you, I highly recommend people to take a step back, and sometimes that means delving into the world of political philosophy.
Mhm.
So that was my long ramble for what I think is the best way of communicating about this topic.
Yeah, and I do agree with that. And I wonder if, because a lot of these issues, right? So I brought up the example of freedom. A lot of these issues and a lot of what people seem to be claiming that they stand for are something like American values. And so if you were to go back, right, and then find the tree in which you guys can use as a demarcation point and say, okay, this is where we kind of this is where we have to start this dialogue, or this is where we, if the issue is American values, which I think is a very big talking point at this point, you go back to the founding and you're almost forced to have that philosophical conversation, because the founding of America was incredibly laced with, I mean, not even laced, it was just full blown liberal philosophy, heavily inspired by John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. I think Thomas Jefferson was like one of the biggest proponents of the Lockean paradigm. And so then you kind of have to start contemplating what exactly you mean by these terms and what exactly you want the future of America to be. And I think that's fine. I think we can be pretty effective at that if we're open minded. One of the big issues that we really run into, and then this starts kind of going into what we were talking about before we started filming, our concerns about, is it the case that, democracy may not be all that it's cracked up to be? Maybe there are other forms of government that are better. And the reason why we're starting to think that, because in this day and age, now we have to deal with what has been dubbed as misinformation or disinformation, and it runs rampant from both sides. Not to be the boring centrist person, it's just an objective fact. Like there's misinformation, basically about anything. I remember bringing up the fact that I saw a tweet that had like 40,000 likes, and I don't know how many of those likes were bots, but it was a tweet that basically was, and I brought this up with you, I remember, like months ago, about the whole Aaron Rodgers situation, where Aaron Rodgers was criticizing Jimmy Kimmel, criticizing Jimmy Kimmel. Um, I think he made a joke. I could be wrong, but he made some joke or statement or whatever about Jimmy Kimmel being worried about the Epstein files being released, because his name was going to be on it. And Jimmy Kimmel snapped back at him. He was really annoyed with him. I think he tweeted out something against him. And then the tweet that I saw was kind of just explaining what happened. Aaron Rodgers, uh, you know, said that Jimmy Kimmel was going to be on the list. Jimmy Kimmel snapped back at him, and then the list came out, and Jimmy Kimmel's name was on it, and it had 40,000 likes. It was in the tens of thousands of likes. The issue was that Jimmy Kimmel's name was not on the list, and this was something that you could very easily verify. But you had this tweet with tens of thousands of likes, and there's going to be many people out there who will form very strongly held opinions based on that tweet, and it will feed it. If you have this world's view that the world is against, that that the world's infested with all these famous rich people who are trying to pestilentially spread the woke doctrine to everyone else, and then you see this tweet and that just kind of like feeds into your worldview, and you're thinking like, yeah, this is like more evidence of the fact that everything that I believe is true, even though you could very easily verify that wasn't true. Um, and so I'd like to hear. I know this is going to be a very, very heavy question, and I apologize, but how do we deal with this? Is like, what do we do? Do we get rid of Twitter? Do we implement something within these websites to make sure that they don't spread disinformation? But then that rises the problem of, well, do we trust this thing that is allegedly going to not spread disinformation?
Yeah, so I'm not gonna be um I think disinformation is a huge problem, but I'm not gonna take the step of like, oh, now that we have a more like information system that creates a lot more misinformation, I'm suddenly going to be like democracy is a failure. Um, I'm, I think I'm beholden to at least consider that democracy is still a pretty good form of government, um, because it is one of the most successful, you know, systems of government in the world. Um, but yeah, there's definitely issues that you have to deal with. People, I think it's very easy to be like, ah, something's not working. Let me, you know, give up on it and gotta have a completely different new system. And oftentimes you can approach problems like and think about them and make modifications to your system, adapt to some degree. Um, I think it's important to understand, going back to the sort of the political philosophy aspect, sort of what makes democracy such a good system. And I think it really comes down um, to you want to have a system that is stable, effective, and and it has both of those down pretty good, especially with some degree of checks and balances. Um, it's stable enough in the sense that um, it operates on a majority principle when other historical forms of government don't. Right? You can have a monarchy. Monarchy only survives in the sense that you have like power to maintain it, and sometimes that power exists, but there is something nice about a system where at least the majority of people, in theory, maybe not necessarily always in practice, agree that it's working as intended. And at the end of the day, it's a purely conceptual agreement, right? The Constitution, rule of law, they're all abstract. They're all abstractions. They only work if everybody sort of believes that they work. And the problem is, I think um, there's a lot of people who are starting to challenge the idea that it works, which isn't inherently bad, but it can almost create a self-fulfilling prophecy where skepticism of the system can make the system work worse and will make more skepticism of it. And that is a weakness of a democracy to some degree. Um, yeah, but I'm going off on a tangent. What do you think?
Allow me to push back a little just to see what your thoughts on this pushback are. So you had said that democracy, we have to remind ourselves why democracies were implemented in the first place. They're stable, they're effective, and what was the other one that you said?
Um, they're stable and effective, and well, I think those are the only two things I said. But to elaborate, it's you have a system where most people are happy with the system, and that inherently is fairly stable, um, right? If you have a system where most people don't trust it, it's going to be only through violence and um, like force that it's going to be able to maintain itself. Um, Now, that doesn't mean that democracy isn't also held up to some degree by the glue of violence, right? It kind of is, but it's an abstract form of violence, um, right? Like if you have enough people who genuinely believe that the democracy is corrupt and illegitimate, then you can easily have a civil war or more violence break out.
Let's say you encounter someone who says that democracy really only works, it's really only effective and stable when all of the denizens of that country are operating on good information. So if everyone who is voting for who's going to be the representative, everyone is voting, is pretty well informed in terms of what's going on in the country, how the economy is working, what exactly are the big issues occurring in the country. It works in that sense because you have people who are well informed, they have different opinions, it's a plurality of thought, but they can all voice their opinions, right? However, if you have the same group of people that are all operating on bad information that they got either from Twitter or Facebook or whatever website they may get, or even demagogues, people who are already in positions of power or who were in positions of power, if they're all operating on incorrect information and incorrect in different ways. So, for example, you could have one group of people who has wrong information because the only thing that they listen to or watch is the Daily Wire, versus another group of people who also are misinformed, but their misinformation is different because all they listen to is, Salon or Pink News. And then you have just a bunch of people who don't really actually know what's going on. They have information, they have beliefs, they have strongly held beliefs, they want to vote, but they're not operating on good information. It's not even a matter of the fact that they have different opinions about how the world should work. It's a matter of the fact that they don't even have opinions that are formed by the correct info. And so, if that's the case, then democracy is not stable and it's certainly not effective. And so maybe because we're kind of forced now, because Twitter exists, Facebook exists, the internet exists, has changed things dramatically. Maybe now we need to think about something maybe like a technocracy, where the people who are voting are people who we can reliably say are informed about these issues. They know the actual data behind the economy, behind crime rates, behind what's being taught in schools. Maybe we do need some group of experts, because unfortunately the general public just cannot be trusted anymore.
So I would say that this is. Um, I'm going to make an appeal to the idea that that is not necessarily democracy not working as intended. Let's say it is the case that there are different factions that have huge grievances between another to the point where they cannot maintain the sort of narrative of shared interests, and it breaks or something cracks, and that, right, is that democracy not working as intended? I would propose that no, the democracy works in the sense you have a group of, like, let's say we had a democracy with North Korea. We had a state called North Korea, right? Or I don't know, Iran or something. And they have completely different values to us. And they are, I don't know, or let's say you have a state that's making more abstract, it's just cannibals and they eat each other, and we decide we formed a union at some point, but now they're all cannibals, and we have a democracy with them to say, oh, okay, democracy has failed because these two groups of people don't have shared set of values in order to to create a system together. I would say no, actually, democracy is works under the assumption that enough people, a quorum of people, do have a shared set of values and can live side by side with each other while maintaining some degree of disagreement, right? You don't need full agreement, but you need enough agreement that you're willing to accept people in power that you don't like. You have to accept some negotiation, some give and take. But if there's so much give and take that you just are like completely, it's antithetical to everything you value, I don't think that's necessarily anti-democratic for it to break. What it does mean is asking the question, why did those set of values get to that point? So uh, it could be the case that democracy still is the best form of government that we have, but additionally, it's also important for that democracy to have good educational institutions, good checks and balances, good information regulations, right? To maintain people, with communication with each other, understanding of each other. Like there's a, so it's because there's a bunch of other things besides just the general structure of government. I can't attribute all failures of a country, let's say the US, if it is in a state of failure, which is not, we're not there yet, right? But if there is a point, right? Basically, my idea is like, let's say, maybe democracy is working great in Norway or something. I don't know what the political situation in Norway is, but and maybe that's because they have a good education system and everybody has shared values, and then democracy works. And if you have a different country where people don't have shared values, then the democracy will fail. But I don't know if that's necessarily moralizing on the democracy. It's not a failure of democracy. It's democracy working as you would expect it to, given the circumstances on the ground. So yeah,
In which case, would you say that democracy is heavily reliant on culture, where it's not just the fact that we can argue about the fact that from a moral standpoint, we should have a democracy, not even just because it's effective, but because ethically speaking, we're talking about you know rules and laws that are being made on a group of people. Well, those people should have a say on what laws affect them. Completely disregarding that, democracies are heavily reliant, if they are to work, on making sure that the culture of that country is a culture in which they are heavily educated on how the government works, or at least they want to be heavily educated on how the government works. They know exactly, they know things about the electoral college, they know things about how the presidency works, they know things about their own constitution, and they know things about why certain laws were put in place. They know certain things. Again, I'm not talking about a very deep dive analysis or anything like that, but generally speaking, they know what type of values were influenced the founding fathers. They know what type of values the founding fathers wanted to espouse, right? Like liberal values of freedom, um, and individual sovereignty. Would you say that it's heavily reliant on the group of people, like having a culture, a shared culture of at least, maybe not even like agreeing with it, but at least understanding it?
it's trivially obvious if you think about the fact that yes, there's different countries, right? Like if democracy is, if you give democracy this super high standard where it's supposed to always work and never break, then you'd be like, okay, well, the ideal form of government is a total world democracy, the new world order, a full democratic system where everybody is uh, in the same sort of uni government and everybody is a full, perfect democratic system. Um, like it's like, I don't mean to get political, but right, like let's make a democracy, and the democracy is all the people in Israel and all the people in Palestine, right? Like that that will fail because they don't have shared values, or Russia, Ukraine, or any two countries at war, and be like, okay, now you're a democracy, right? Congrats, and now you're going to break because you don't have shared values. So I think it's people who want democracy to put democracy at this super high standard where it's like a country can't break because it doesn't have shared values. Well, democracy works under the assumption that you have people who have kind of generally the same values. And the question of does that always hold? Is a democracy obligated to maintain that? Like, what if people shift and changes? What if groups of people change? Um, like as countries get more in shared values, you can have something like the European Union, where they sort of work, sort of kind of make a unit government. They kind of like, okay, we have enough shared values that we're willing to uh, to put an additional layer of kind of democracy on top of us because we are confident that we do have these shared values. And it can work on the opposite, like a country that has a big gap in values can break. Um, I still think that is inevitable in almost any form of government. It's almost entirely difficult to maintain everybody to have enough shared values that there's no conflict in the world. Um, and that works on global systems or even individuals, like family, like every collection of people is beholden to how much they're willing to negotiate with each other versus to fight it out. So that's why I'm sort of I don't really view changing values as a criticism of democracy. Um, I think that's democracy working as you'd expect it to, given the circumstances presented. And now, whether, like in the case of America or the U.S., we've had historically a sense of shared values, traditional American values, freedom, liberté, all that jazz. And to the degree, longest surviving constitution, we've been able to maintain that. And I'm not fully doomer. I'm not like, okay, we've lost that, now we should break and make two different countries. I still think most people in the U.S. have shared values. Um, However, I am very frustrated by um, the type of undermining of our shared values that I see. Like when people are like, actually, it's not other people who also have the best interest of the country in mind, but might disagree with me on some stuff. It instead becomes, they're devil worshippers, or they're they have a cabal, or they're rigging the election, or like when people stop thinking other people in their groups are genuine, real people who just have a disagreement with them, and instead become like demonizing and like viewing them as like evil inherently, then yeah, I'm very frustrated by the trajectory of that. But I'm not going to say that's I'm going to be like, okay, now democracy has failed, because this problem will exist even if you have a different form of government. If you have a big enough rift in what the values of the people are, there is no form of government that will fix that without changing people's minds. Like if even if you have your technocracy that's like, I'm going to make the perfect decision that optimizes everybody's utility, and what if the utility is like you have two people who have completely different utilities, they're completely antithetical to each other. At some point, somebody would be like, "Well, I don't really trust this computer. It keeps making the decisions that I don't like." Right? This, it's doing it in a pure information-based, statistical, like pure democracy, ideal democracy. But the decisions that it comes up with for negotiations are still antithetical to my views, and you'll still have that problem, because that's not a form of government problem. That's a people problem. So
Mhm. Yeah, as cliche as it sounds, there really is this problem of intolerance. And I'll get to that in a little bit because I just want to touch upon what you had said earlier about how democracy only works if essentially if like the people want it to work. And democracy really is just one cog in this multifaceted system, right? Yeah, we have the right to vote, but as you said, like, well, what happens if, like, people in a country with completely different values have the right to vote? Will it even be effective? What happens if all the people in that country decide to choose to, okay, like, well, we're a democratic society now. Let's democratically vote to get rid of democracy. Like, should you be allowed to do that? Or let's democratically vote to say that we should have people who make decisions for us completely, irregardless of what we desire, right? There's more things that should be associated with democracy. And so you have it's an entire system where it's a combination of democracy, of shared values, and hopefully of a group of people that
well, that
understand those
that's
shared
assuming
values.
that if everybody wants this thing, the
Mhm.
Constitution is still stable. Like here's the thing: the Constitution is a piece of paper. It only works under the assumption that people agree that it works. If everybody is like, I actually really want a king, uh, you know, nobody actually believes in the Constitution, you'll have a king. Like,
Mhm.
um, or you'll enough people will with enough power will have enough influence that they can modify, amend, do whatever that needs to be done to make a king happen. Because at the end of the day, it's not like if you have it's the power is still within people, right? Like in theory, if you can have a technocratic utopia and the power is controlled by robots with no human input and control over it, and they want to maintain the Constitution, even if everybody else, every human doesn't want that. Um, you can have a great sci-fi book for it, right? It's an interesting question. Like, what if the Constitution is better than the people? Like, um, But that is scary, right? Because okay, what if the Constitution is bad? Like, what if there's something wrong with it, right? So at the end of the day, um, it has to be people,
Hmm.
and it has to be no matter what form of government you're using, it's going to have to be um, people deciding, and it's going to have to be some buy-in, or you have to agree to partake in this sort of social contract. You're like, I am willing to sacrifice some rights, some freedoms, in order to reap the benefits of a collective system and all that that entails. Right? I'm willing to sacrifice, pay taxes, to to um, lose some rights, lose the ability to I don't know, kill, murder, steal. I said kill and murder, whatever. Um, in order that I can live with other people who also have to lose these rights, because we believe that if we all lose these rights together, we're going to all be better off. Um, so for me, I'm less concerned over democracy itself um, failing, and I think you get into the world of like pure game theory. Like I'm very Hobbesian in my thinking, right? I'm very like this is what will happen when people act in their self-interest. This is what types of governments will form. Um, is one of them more moral than the other? Not really, right? Like if you create a perfect moral system, but it has no military, and then a different immoral system comes in and invades and takes over all the land, even though you had a more morally perfect system, you still lost, and the you know autocracy won because they spend more of their resources on military, right? Um, so I think um, yeah, so I'm less conservative, like the morality or of different systems, and more of like in execution, how do they handle? Like, are they? What are their pros and cons? What are their? How do they fare in different environments? I think is how I view this. Um, maybe it's very cynical. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the big issues is that you had said something earlier about, you mentioned that you think at the end of the day, like most people probably still somewhat share the same values. And I think that's true. I think at the end of the day, even though you might have different conceptions of what something like freedom is, or whether or not you want to have a more paternalistic government versus a more laissez-faire government, we all kind of agree that, hey, freedom is a good thing. We might define it differently, but because we think freedom is a good thing, we're very allergic and averse to the idea of a monarchy. And so, yeah, I agree with you. Generally speaking, we do generally agree on these sorts of values. I think the big problem also is that politics has turned into a bit of a sports game in which there's there's this idea that if you support someone with a blue tie or if you support someone with a red tie, it becomes almost heretical to criticize the tie that you mostly align with. And I know it sounds like super trite and something like, wow, this is something that we've been talking about in 2015. It's amazing. We're still talking about it today. It's very cliche, and I agree, it can come off as cliche, but I think I've seen it most pronounced recently with the advent of Trump and Biden now having to step down and Kamala going up. I've It's very obvious to anyone who's kind of watching from the outside. Not that I'm on the outside, but it's very obvious that what we're dealing with right now is pretty much politics becoming a sport, where there's this inability. I think it's more pronounced on the conservative side, and I apologize to conservatives listening to this. But anything that Trump does that's bad, you just cannot criticize it. Whereas with Biden, even people on the left, even people who support Biden, are very open about the fact that he's old. He probably shouldn't be running, but this is pretty much all that we have at this point when we need someone to beat Trump. I don't know how conducive or how healthy this is. I mean, I don't think it's healthy at all. But this idea of let's turn this into a sport. Let's beat the other person as as swiftly as possible, and this complete um, just this complete avoidance of any issues that your party does. And to the extent that it is brought up, it's usually just, okay, like you bring up an issue with the person that you support. Well, what about the issue with the other person? It's almost become a sport. And I think that a solution to this, or a possible solution to this, is to stop viewing politicians as celebrities. And that's not a comment on the fact that we have a celebrity who was in the White House and who most likely will be in the White House pretty soon. But it's just the fact that we really need to stop kind of viewing these people as if they genuinely do have your interest in mind. And I know that sounds completely antithetical to what we've been saying about liberalism and democracies, and what, we have to vote for people who hold our values in their heart. Because at the end of the day, the big focus really is on to make sure that they win the election. And when you view these people almost as idols, as celebrities that you're a big fan of, it kind of defeats the entire purpose um, of this almost like, system that is supposed to kind of function, and we all vote and we all kind of give our opinions on who should be the leader based on the values that we purport. But if instead we're viewing it almost as a political game, then our focus really is on just making sure that the person that we like the most gets into presidency, regardless of the fact that we, yeah, as you said, we do have to kind of give and take into the system and make sure that we're all working collectively together. And I don't know what I mean, what are your thoughts on this idea of like, how do we view these political figures?
So in any system, right? I'm very cynical. Um, I am very egoist in my viewing of people. I think everybody acts self-interestedly. That being said, I think oftentimes people overstate what self-interested means. So I think ideally you build a system where self-interestedness, like being self-interested, is also in the interest of other people, right? So your ideal system has some degree of defense mechanisms against purely selfish behavior, right? Like you want to make a system where you're rewarded for being selfish. Sorry, not you're rewarded for being selfish. Like everybody's rewarded for being selfish. So for example, um, rule of law to some degree acts or operates on the idea of discouragement via some form of punishment, right? So if you commit a crime, you're going to go to jail. So you're dissuaded from acting in certain ways. Um, and so in an ideal system, if we had like a perfect democracy, a politician should be self-interested in doing what's best for their constituents, right? So like I do things that my constituents like, I get more votes, I get reelected, right? And I think people are sometimes overly skeptical of how poor the U.S. is about this. So I think even politicians, I think politicians to some degree do are self-interested to be in the real self-interest of their constituents. So I think most politicians are genuinely doing what is best for their constituents to get reelected. Um, like, and when there's a bribery or think where you can see that that isn't working, there are degrees of checks and balances for this. So I'm maybe not as like black pilled on the idea that like all of our politicians are corrupt and like selfish, terrible people. Um, I just hope that we can maintain a system where they aren't allowed to be, where they're genuinely they have real selfish motivations on doing what's good for the people they represent. Um, and I also think people have a natural inclination to do what people like. I think there are a lot of politicians even who just genuinely want to be kind of public servants and do what they think is best. I don't fully discount that everybody is like all virtues are lies, right? I think do people do operate tend to operate on some core beliefs, and some people more and less than others. That's, like, I don't think every politician is corrupt. I think a lot of them are, but not all of them. Um, but I just want to maintain a system that encourages that, right? If you have a system where it's easy to get bribed, there will be more corrupt politicians, right? Like if you're, I don't know, in Russia or something, or so a lot of countries, you just pay off the police, you lose your ticket, you don't get a ticket, right? This is very common. But because we have degrees of the checks and balances in the U.S., where it's like, okay, you get caught when you bribe. There are institutions that like self regulate, right? Like um, Homeland Security will catch you if you're a corrupt cop, maybe sometimes. Like there are some degrees of institutions that help maintain the system. Um, but to go to my actual, I think, more important point for people, I think, is just the idea that knowing that other people not um, are also trying to do what's best for them and for the world in general. Most people aren't bad people, and I think what happens, especially in the framework of sports, right, politics of sports, is I see a lot of viewing the other side as actual monsters, like, like people who are just intrinsically bad or are acting in super bad faith constantly. And I think that's extremely destructive. Like, because I might be, center left, um, or even I think in the point where I was more left. Um, I loved chatting with the right wing people, and they're all fun and cool people, and usually their values are like they care about. Like I might think that their beliefs are completely baseless and ridiculous, but they're normal people, and they got their beliefs from most of the time from genuine reasons, where they're like, I genuinely think that this is what's best. Um, Now, maybe they got their opinions from news sources or some terrible epistemological, like, some rabbit hole or the abyss. I don't know. Maybe Satan whispered into their ear that this is a good thing, but I still think that most people think what they're doing is good, or it's the correct thing. So, so I think it's very important to not view people as motivated by evil, but some people are, and you have to also be wary of that. That's where we're going back to the boogie conversation. No, I'm just kidding. Like there are people who are genuinely like extremely self-interested and have zero actual you know virtues or values or whatever moral framework. But I think it's important to know that most people aren't like this,
Mhm.
and you can usually talk with anybody. Um, and it very much bothers me how much we, as a society, are okay with completely demonizing people. Sorry, I'm saying the same thing over and over again. So,
But like it is something that is it is something that a lot of people kind of either forget or just genuinely don't believe that most people, even the worst people in your head, think that they're doing good. I think that instead what a lot of people like to do is to, and I've done this too before, excuse me, it's to label everyone as a grifter. And I recognize that you can identify certain patterns that increase the likelihood of certain individuals grifting for the sake of monetary gain. But I think generally speaking, probably most people are being genuine in terms of what it is that they believe. They might be getting their information from nefarious places, places that probably aren't reputable, but that kind of would probably play into the worldview where, well, the reason why this place is considered reputable is because the people in power don't want the truth to be going out. And so I think that's another big thing that we really have to deal with. And this is something that has emerged with the growing popularity of populism, where there's this really huge distrust of institutions and this distrust of the media in general. And so then the question that we have to ask ourselves is this distrust warranted? Is it well deserved? And if so, where do we turn to in order to get accurate information about how the world works? Because even if it is the case that the New York Times or the Washington Post are unreliable, for political reasons, they're unreliable. They just haven't been giving us the correct information about how the state of the world is. Does it therefore mean that the outlets that criticize the Washington Post, like Breitbart, does that therefore mean that Breitbart is reliable? And the answer obviously is no. Just because one news source is unreliable doesn't mean that the people who are criticizing that news source are reliable. But it certainly does make us question, well, where do we look for correct information? Are we comfortable relying on our own faculties? So the obvious example is, let's say, the CDC, that has just been constantly criticized for the past couple of years. Even if I were to be of the mind that the CDC is not to be trusted, um, I'm not sure how exactly I would be getting correct information, because I certainly don't trust myself in terms of understanding a lot of these like really difficult medical conversations. Uh, I don't really trust myself to actually look at the studies and form solid conclusions about what I should be doing. And I wouldn't be trusting also the places that are criticizing the CDC. So where do we go from here, right? I mean, this just goes to show how insanely important these institutions are, how they must maintain their integrity, and how us collectively as a group of people, we must all kind of agree, hey, that the system works, these institutions work, we have to trust them, and we have to kind of ensure that there are a set of checks and balances within these institutions to make sure that they don't go corrupt. And so that adds on like this other layer that we weren't even looking at before, where yeah, the government, we have to all collectively make sure that we have shared values, a shared system of trust in the government. But now what about all these institutions as well that have different motivating purposes? What do we do about them? Because if those institutions collapse, then that's the first domino, or whichever domino. It's it's going to just lead to even further disillusion of the liberal democratic system that we have. And so how do we solve this problem? If at the beginning we were talking about, well, making sure that people have correct information, but if the sources of that correct information go away, how do we know what information we have is correct? Because as far as we're concerned, again, we're dealing with Twitter posts with 40,000 likes that have verifiably incorrect information. But what about even harder stuff, right? I mean, what about crime rate statistics? If we don't trust any of these statistics that come from even the FBI reports, I mean, what do we do then? Who do we trust? And then that kind of just leads us almost inevitably to demagogic figures that are mostly like associated with populism. Populism, you had mentioned, is not during the recording, but populism is very hard to define, and it is. It's insanely hard to define, because right wing populists versus left wing populists, they can come off as very different. It seems like the only unifying thing that populists have is it's the people versus the elites, and so it gives rise to these figures. And how trustworthy are these figures? We don't
Mm.
know. We don't know where they get their information from. We don't know why we should be trusting them. All we know is that there's these institutions in the government that we definitely don't trust. And so, therefore, the only place that we can kind of put our trust in are the people who were criticizing them to begin with, because at least we can point to them and say, at least they were right about something.
Right. So it's kind of a difficult problem fundamentally because there could be a scenario, right, where the institutions are actually genuinely fully corrupt. Um, it's not entirely impossible. So if I come from the lens of like, okay, well, we have to always have a baseline trust in our institutions, and because if we don't have a baseline trust in our institutions, that we cannot form, uh, our perfect democracy where everybody's happy and healthy, whatever. Then when you have a situation where the institutions are actually genuinely corrupt, you might have a problem, right? So, so I don't want to fully dismiss the idea that it's impossible for institutions to be top down corrupt, right? What I will say is you can often, if you have a genuine interest in the state of an institution, it's not impossible to find out. Like, this is not beyond the world of fact finding and epistemology. There are whistleblowers, there are people who are in these institutions. The bigger the institution is, the more likely you have people to talk about it on the inside. Um, it's a nice natural correcting mechanism of large institutions is that they're also way more difficult to keep private. Um, that being said, uh, yeah, that being said, I think oftentimes when I hear, "Oh, this institution is corrupt," oftentimes they might even be pointing out a real problem in the institution. But the problem isn't always that it is corruption, right? Like there could be a lot of other types of problems, and I think there's a big misattribution problem. So for the CDC, like public health is not a science. Okay, like public health will make mistakes in communication, mistakes in facts, especially for like a emergent virus. Like when they say, "Oh, you have to wash your hands and scrub everything," before we knew that like COVID doesn't really spread off surfaces. Okay, and then it's you're like, "Well, they told us this and this, and it was all lies." And like, okay, well, did you look at the timeline? Did they say this before or after all the evidence came out? Uh, the problem is not really. I don't think that like. I think what's happening is you have people undermining institutions for not always like the best reasons. Not to say it's impossible for them to have good reasons, but oftentimes it's just pure like you know fake news or like some or just misattributing incompetence for malice or even competence, but doing your best decision based on the given evidence and then being wrong because new evidence comes out that changes your perspective, and then you said something that wasn't true at some point. Um, and there's also institutions have a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of like layers, and at each layer somebody said something. If you ever worked in a big company, like the bigger it is, the more like bureaucracy and like inefficiencies start to develop. In the same way, like a big country is going to have a lot more inefficiencies and bureaucracy in it. Like, the bigger you go, the more bureaucratic and um, everything seems to be. So, so I think what's happening is people are, yeah. I guess I'm not entirely sure how to, like. Your question is more about populism, right? Populism for me, yeah, it's a sort of anti-establishment position, and I think that is in and of itself kind of a check and balance, right? Like I don't want people to be full on pro-establishment on everything. Like we have to trust the establishment everywhere. There should be healthy skepticism for large institutions. I just wish it came off of better grounds, right? Like I wish it was like more evidence based or more results based rather than feelings based or just so I don't have a like universal prescription on what to do. I'm not going to say populism is inherently bad. Like I think populism can be good if you are in a completely corrupt government where all the institutions are inept. uh, Populism could be important.
Hmm.
But I think in this case in the US, people are being populist or being anti establishment or anti institutions and then just completely throwing away institutions that have brought significant value to us, right? And I think it's just important to know why these institutions existed, and not being like, I don't like it, so let me completely throw it out, without taking some time to consider, okay, well, why does this institution exist? Like, like, um, so yeah, like you can have completely useless institutions that don't do anything, that would be better off destroyed, but it has to be based on evidence or like data, and not, um, you know, misinformation or like fake news or conspiracies, that don't have like good grounding to them.
Mhm.
And yeah, so yeah, that's my frustration. That's how I view it. I don't like, um, I don't want to say that populism is inherently bad, but I am often skeptical of populist movements, because I often feel like populist movements have a tendency of being reactionary and not like based on good evidence.
Yeah, populism, I wouldn't say is inherently bad or inherently good. It really just depends in the form that it comes in. So, for example, and this kind of it's just a matter of the fact that populisms, like, they manifest themselves in very very different ways. So much so to the point where they can advocate different forms of government. So you can have someone like Bukele or Duterte, for example, in El Salvador and the Philippines, respectively, where they're really gung ho on making sure that they kind of execute people who are who are completely like gang members and stuff like that, almost like fascistic and authoritarian. But then you can also have populist movements that are people like Bernie Sanders, whom I don't think I'm not even sure if he would consider himself a populist, but he's usually associated with that label.
Yeah, there's some
Or
degree of establishment skepticism, but definitely not to the same degree as other
certainly not a
figures.
Bukele or a
Yeah,
Trump
like he
or
still
yeah.
is like, okay, he's not completely undermining institutions, but he does have some skepticism for some establishment institutions, but not all of
He
them.
operates within the establishment, even though he criticizes it, which is, I think, perfectly
Yeah, that's
legitimate.
what ideally you want.
Hmm. You have also like in Spain, what is it, the Podemos party in Spain, and then you have the Le Pens in France. They're manifesting themselves in very very different ways, and so what really matters is not the populist label so much as just what exactly it is that they're advocating for. What type of government are they hoping to implement? Are they more authoritative like El Salvador or the Philippines, or are they much more in line with general broad mainstream politics, but it's more about revolutionizing them from the inside? They're still operating within the mechanisms that were set in place, but they're making sure that the governments have more transparency. They're making sure that the people have much more of a say in terms of what politics are able to affect them. So I agree with
Yeah,
you. The populist label doesn't really matter that much. And if anything, people have kind of just used that populist label as a way of just dismissing
yeah,
legitimate
dismissing all
criticisms.
forms of criticism against institutions
Hmm.
and saying it's all populism or it's all the same. When you have some people who are like, this institution is evil and corrupt and has to be destroyed, versus, well, I have some critiques about how this institution operates, and I think there's some motive, like, there's some issue with how it's structured that is causing like results that I don't like. Like, there's degrees to it, and it's also completely based on the state of like you can have a fully corrupt institution in theory, right?
Hmm.
And then you can be like, this institution needs to get dismantled. It has no purpose. It is just a parasite on our society. That could be true. There has been many institutions like this in the past. Is that the CDC? Probably not, right? Like, um, is that like so it's all the problem is it's all dependent on how accurate is your analysis. How accurate is it? Is it true that it's a fully corrupt institution that Or is it true that there's some legitimate criticism? There's people inside who are acting selfishly. There's not enough checks and balances. There's not enough transparency. You can make a ton of criticisms of institutions. There's so many to be made. Every institution needs to get criticized and analyzed and looked at with utter skepticism. But but then also this but the moment you have people who are like, well, like I need to destroy this institution because this person in it lied, or this person, like it's that's when it becomes problematic. It's when you
Hmm.
have like just the criticism does not match that reality, and people don't operate on reality. People operate on emotions and um, sound bites. So it's very difficult to any problem that's based on what the actual facts of the matter, and you can't just say like with a clean paintbrush, just say all of this is bad or all of this is good. It's very difficult to assess. But I will say that there are certain patterns of populism that you need to watch out for and be skeptical of.
Hmm.
You can operate off patterns, right? Like you can say uh, many populist movements fall into the trap of becoming almost religious like because they more believe their narrative than what reality. Like they're following they're following a story and not like what the data is. There's a story that they believe and they like the story and it makes them feel good. And that's a trap that a lot of populist movements have, even ones I would agree with.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, and I think that's a we're coming up on an hour and 20 minutes now. I think that's a good way. It's a good place to end it. This was a very fun conversation. I
of
think that
course,
there's still a lot of things that we can really talk about, but there's only so much that you can really dissect in about an hour and 20 minutes. And I'm sure everyone has things to do instead of listening to us. We both have to go watch the. I think they're still live right now. The Boogie
oh,
two
dude, the
nine eight eight
finale of the
locale.
Boogie saga.